Hello to the Argument subscribers and to other people tuning in on Substack. My name is Kobe Yank Jacobs. I'm a Tech and Society fellow here at the Argument. That means that I report on technology and, well, I kind of have a broad license because of the and society part of my title, which is really nice. I get to write about a whole bunch of stuff. But this week I'm starting a series of Substack Lives uh, in order to dig into debates in AI. One of the things that I notice about a lot of AI writing, no matter how good the reporting is you always got to spend a lot of time bringing people up to speed, right? And so, what I thought we would do here is bring on some experts to have a conversation, a little bit more like you're sitting at a bar listening in. And more than listening in, I want to give people the chance to ask questions that they have themselves. And so next week, you can hear me talk to Bara Chandar, who is one of the top economists studying job loss. You can hear me talk to J.S. Denane, who is one of the top researchers tracking AI capabilities. But this week, we've got Nathan Witkin, who is a research scientist at the NYU Stern Tech and Society Lab. I first tuned into Nathan because of his excellent work on Substack. And so, Nathan, thanks for joining me for the first one of these.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kobe. I'm really excited to be here.
Now, the first time I came across your work, it was because you had an extremely spicy take. So, if anyone listening here has heard that AI progress is doubling every 7 months, or more recently, they've heard that it's doubling every 4 months, it basically traces back to this one graph called the meter graph. And the meter graph is basically looking at how long it takes a human to complete a task and then saying, can an AI complete that same task successfully half the time, right? So if we give you a software task, we measure how long it takes you to do it, and then we give the same task to an AI. Can it complete it successfully half the time? This graph is upstream of so much of AI buzz and discourse. And so, Nathan, just to get us started here and to get us right to the heart of this debate, um, I wanted to know why you take issue with this graph. What beef do you have with the most famous graph in AI?
Yeah, so I can do the quick version, and then we can expand on anything specific you want to get into more detail on. But basically, there's two big buckets of problem with the benchmark that this graph is based on. So the first big one has to do with the tasks themselves, and the really big problem here, which to their credit, the creators of the graph are sort of well aware of, have been public about, is just that the tasks are not realistic representations of white collar work. So they're these kind of relatively contrived, context free, automatically verifiable coding tasks. And as a result of that, they're also exactly the types of tasks that are the easiest for the frontier AI labs to optimize for through what's called reinforcement learning or post training. And so that means that progress on this graph diverges from the type of progress that we can expect in more realistic, real life enterprise settings, basically. So that's one of the big issues. The other big one, which I think is a lot more problematic, partially because Meter itself wasn't extremely frank about this, in my opinion, is that the entire benchmark, right, depends on the accuracy of the human task completion times. Like that's the y-axis on the graph that you have up front right now. And so it depends on where they're getting that data. But the human completion times were collected from this kind of ad hoc convenience sample of people that are basically just like professional acquaintances and friends of employees at Meter's lab. And that creates problems related to what we call sampling bias, right? The idea that like this is not a group that's
Mhm.
representative of most software engineers. And on top of that, they're only getting maybe like 1 to 5 benchmarks per task. So there's very little what you'd call statistical power here either, just not a lot of data and data that's from a very small slice of the software engineering population. And so that just creates problems generalizing from this graph, right? Because what it's really showing us is how much faster AI is improving pegged to the amount of time that it takes this very small and specific group of coders to complete these tasks. And I can get into more detail here, but Meter
Yeah.
also did a lot of internal work to see how representative those completion times were, and themselves found that they were heavily inflated compared to other populations of software engineers.
Okay. So now I want you to imagine that someone who's watching the Substack live right now has just
Yeah.
walked into a bar,
Okay.
and you and I were grabbing a beer at the bar. We were talking about this graph. We were duking it out over the methodology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And what we wanted to do for this person we're inviting into our chat is say, hey, here's what the significance of this is economically. Now, if we were to
Okay.
do that, I think we would break down your critiques maybe into a few buckets, right? So you would have some of these methodology critiques, which I don't want to fully set aside, but our episode here, I want to focus on economic consequences
Okay.
of certain measurements of AI. And so I think what I would lock into here is the 50% time horizon, which is something that often doesn't get as much focus as it ought to when we're looking at this graph, right? This is saying that at a task that is, say, 4 hours long, uh, an AI is completing it successfully about half the time. Now, a lot of the work that you did after this has to do with AI reliability, which means that if I'm sitting in the workplace and I need to give a task to my AI, right? It's one thing to say, well, an AI can complete this task sometimes. And it's a different thing to say that an AI can consistently complete this task, right? And so someone's walked into the bar, they're looking at this graph, they have their own experience of being at work and handing things to
Mhm.
an AI and watching it succeed sometimes and fail sometimes. Put this graph in the context of whether or not people in the workplace can actually hand tasks off to an AI reliably.
Yeah. So I think that gets at what I see as one of the big problems with the graph, which is just that it's a very poor guide to whether or not someone can do that for any given task they're likely to encounter in real life, right? In enterprise setting, right? So the first reason, which you got at, is just that it's measuring whether or not AI can complete these tasks only half the time, right? And obviously, in a lot of settings, you're just not even going to waste your time asking an AI model to do something if you can only expect like a 50% success rate. That's not going to matter in the context of like a contrived benchmark where you have infinite resources to just run this benchmark over and over and over again. But you're paying for the tokens that the AI model is using in order to complete the task. You have a limited amount of time in your workday. You have a limited amount of mental energy, right? And even like capacity to get frustrated by the problems you're encountering with your AI model. So like it's just not telling you much of significance as someone in even like a software engineering job in most contexts to see that an AI model can complete this like arbitrarily context free hacking or web server creation task half the time. It's very difficult, if possible at all, to see that and infer to I can use an AI
Mhm.
model at my workplace for this particular set of tasks. You just can't make that inference in most cases.
Right. So let me give you the pushback that I've often heard from people who like
Mm-hmm.
to lend some credence to this graph or to measures like it, right? Which is to say that you have measures of AI progress, like can it do math problems, right? So, for instance, one of the common benchmarks is to test AI on graduate level math or graduate level science. These are very discrete multiple choice answers, almost like standardized tests in many cases. And then you have somewhat more complex benchmarks, right? Things that are asking people to do, or asking, sorry, the AI to do long horizon agentic tasks, something where you have to chain together a bunch of steps that feels a little bit more like the workplace. And
Mm-hmm.
so the pushback that I've often heard is we need a pluralism of approaches, right? There's no such thing as, quote, AI capability that is one thing. You want to know how well it's doing in a certain, on these, say, more standardized, discrete, context free metrics as one measure of a certain kind of capability that AI has. And then you want to have what some have called, say, open world evaluations on the other end
Yeah.
of the spectrum, which is something where, like what Anthropic did, where it gave Claude the chance to run a vending machine as if it were a business and see how much it succeeds or fails. And so then, if that's our spectrum of measuring AI capability, right, we have like these discrete multiple choice answer type benchmarks. On the other end, we give it a real world task and say good luck. Maybe the meter graph and things like it fall in the middle there. And what we need is a plurality of approaches in order to figure out how fast AI is progressing in a way that gives us relevant economic data or economic information. So tell me why you would take issue with that framing of it.
So I wouldn't necessarily take issue with that framing at a high level. all information, is good information at some level, right? If you have the appropriate context. And I think in this case, the problem was more so that most folks who were encountering this research just did not have the appropriate context. And I think some of that Meter is to blame for because they presented the research in a way that I don't think adequately communicated some of the limitations that I was worried about. So like they really didn't say almost anything publicly, and there's very little detail about it, even in the paper itself associated with the benchmark, on the sample of coders that's used to extract these human baselining times, right? And so given that's a really small non-representative sample, to present that as just how long it takes software engineers to do X or Y is extremely misleading, right? It's not something that you would do in a context where you have another work of social science that's having to pass through peer review and so on. You need to be a lot more frank than that about where your sample is coming from, how you're collecting it. But I think I would also say that there are just better ways to do this sort of pluralistic approach that are a little more tilted towards trying to give people a realistic guide to how AI is going to affect work, right? So there are plenty of other benchmarks out there, although to Meter's credit, some of these are a little bit more recent, and so they're obviously taking on this this challenge, this task of benchmarking AI models at an earlier point in time before some of this was created. But now we have a much wider array of benchmarks that really do use more realistic tasks in more realistic settings. And so I'm all for pluralism, but it's, I think, difficult to see where an approach like this, especially given the lack of frankness surrounding some of the limitations of the research, would be preferable to an approach that was more balanced towards some of the more realistic kind of reliability focused benchmarks that are a bit more common now.
Okay, so what I want to do here then is I want to take this seemingly arcane technical question of how should we be measuring AI progress and connect it to two things. One is what individual people feel or say they feel about their interactions with AI in the workplace. I want to get to this reliability question, right? You need to hand a task off to AI, and you're asking the question, not can it do this thing sometimes, but can it do this thing reliably enough to take over the task, right? We want to start there, and then I want to move to what we're seeing in terms of actual economic data and statistics to see basically if your case about AI reliability matches what we're seeing in the real world. And so that's kind of the arc I want to take here. In the meantime, I want to remind the audience that if you have questions while we're talking about this, particularly with reference to your AI use cases, things that you're trying to hand off at work and having difficulty with, times you're finding AI unreliable, go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll be able to ask some of those questions to Nathan before we hit the 30-minute mark, which is right around where we're looking to wrap this episode. So go ahead and be active in the chat. And if you're enjoying this conversation and you want to get it out there, go ahead and hit Restack, which you can find, I think, at the bottom of your screen. So Nathan, you mentioned in your piece on AI reliability that when Anthropic did a study, a very, very large study, interviewing 81,000 people around the world using Claude as an LLM interviewer, that one of people's top concerns was this question of AI reliability. So 27% of people said they were worried about AI reliability in terms of hallucinations, inaccuracy, and then this is a technical way that Anthropic rephrased their concerns, quote, verification burden defeating the purpose. The point of that being you just have to double check AI's work too much. And so 27% of people were worried about this. It was one of the top worries about AI that came out of this massive global study. And so I keep using this word reliability as a placeholder for the idea that you can hand off a task to AI. Give us your definition of reliability as you've written about it.
Yeah, so I also meant it to be this pretty big tent term that can refer to a lot of subsidiary factors. I like the way that you described it, basically, whether or not, if you're in a real enterprise setting, with all the different realistic factors that entails, you can hand off a task to an AI model and expect it to complete it successfully according to your desires and specifications. I do think it would help to add a little concreteness here, though, by referring back to some of the research that I'm leading on in that essay, because a lot of what I'm drawing on is a specific paper by a postdoc at Princeton named Stephen Rabanser and some of his colleagues that are associated with this idea of AI as a normal technology, right? Basically, a group of researchers that are trying to take a more measured approach to understanding AI and how it's going to affect the economy. And this paper, called Towards a Science of AI Agent Reliability, gives its own much more precise definition that I lean on heavily. So maybe I could explain that in a little more detail.
Sure, yeah.
That definition has 4 different components. So one is consistency. Does the system behave the same way when you run it multiple times under identical conditions? The second factor they look at is what they call robustness. When operating conditions deviate from normal, does the system degrade gracefully or fail abruptly? Meaning, like, if you change relatively innocuous aspects of the environment the AI is operating in, does that cause some kind of catastrophic failure, or does it only create minor issues at worst? That's the second factor they're interested in.
Mhm.
The third they call predictability. That's essentially, do models themselves know and accurately anticipate when they're likely to fail or succeed at certain tasks? And the last one is what they call safety. Basically, just when a mistake of any kind for any reason occurs, are the resulting consequences severe, especially costly, or are they minor? So I think that's a really great definition. And I use reliability in a few different senses in the essay, but I think that'd be a good one to anchor on because I'm heavily basing parts of that essay on that paper.
Yeah.
And so I think that covers a lot of the main bases.
And let me jump in here to add some context to what you're saying in this paper. I think part of
Sure.
what you're saying here, or part of what the researchers you're referring to here are saying is those 4 ideas that define reliability don't don't go up on a graph in the same way that the capability frontier is going up. So that graph that we were just debating, the meter graph, you can take issue with it. You can look at other measures as we talked about on either end of the spectrum, right? The something that's more like a multiple choice test, something that is more of an open world evaluation. But what we're looking at is trends in AI where what an AI can do sometimes is going up. And what you're saying, Nathan, is that this line of AI capability going up does not necessarily lead to reliability improving at the same rate, right? Reliability might have a much smaller increase every time a new model comes out compared to capability, the frontier of AI going up. Frame that in context for us in a workplace setting. Like, why might this lead to white collar jobs seeing AI adoption at a slower rate than tracking only capability would suggest?
Right. So the basic reason is just that adoption in realistic settings hinges in some ways more on reliability than capability, right?
Mm.
Because when you're using AI in your workplace, you have to worry about things like how consistent is it? What type of costs am I or my business likely to incur when something goes wrong? Can the model handle the kind of fine-grained context of the particular job I do, as well as like changes and dynamic changes in that context. And that's a question that's not often asked in these capability facing benchmarks, right?
Mhm.
None of those questions are, right? So I just emphasize that when you're running an AI model on a capability focused benchmark, you just don't have to worry about, I'd argue, the vast majority of variables that determine the utility of adoption in an enterprise setting. And so if you want to learn about adoption in real workplaces, it generally makes more sense to look at reliability focused metrics than capability focused ones.
I'm going to pivot from an audience question here. One of the questions we got are there specific industries where AI is least likely to be adopted? And if I can modify this question a bit, what I would say is industries where we would expect it to be adopted based on what it can do right now, where it's not being adopted because of the reliability question.
Yeah, that's great. So one would just be any industry where the cost of failure is extremely high, right? So one
Mhm.
example would be like in the healthcare industry. right? And
Mhm.
this isn't to say that there hasn't been AI adoption in the healthcare industry, but there's been less than there would be if AI was more reliable, because obviously in healthcare, if something goes wrong, someone's life could be at stake or serious injury could be possible. Another area would be like in the legal profession. There has been a fair amount of AI adoption in the legal profession. But again, you have to worry about regulatory concerns. You have to worry about liability. We've had a lot of these kind of very public gaffes in which lawyers used an AI model to generate some of the documentation involved in a court case, and then were censored for that. So any field where there's a high cost of failure is one where you're going to have to be a lot more worried about reliability issues. And I think on top of that, just fields that don't have clear cut, verifiable metrics, right, that require AI to navigate more ambiguous sorts of context. So fields that are heavily centered on complex sort of analytical and writing tasks, but that are
Mhm.
largely like non-mathematical or non-coding related. One dimension of reliability has to do with whether or not AI can navigate contexts where you just have a higher degree of ambiguity. And so jobs that involve navigating that sort of ambiguity, certain types of academic research or certain types of policy research that are less quantitative, maybe sort of like geopolitical theorizing or forecasting, AI is not always going to be as effective in those areas
Yeah.
as in software engineering, at least.
Right. So I want to dig into maybe some counter evidence against the idea that reliability is hindering adoption. Or I want to at least
Mhm.
think of a model of how this might work, right? So one thing you can say is the AI itself is not reliable enough to hand off the task. Another thing you could say, which is separate from looking at the technology, is saying that the organization, the company, has not yet figured out how to deploy it in the right way. It hasn't invested the resources into changing the way it does work in the right way in order to get adoption, right? And so that model would be a little bit different than your argument that reliability has been the key bottleneck here. What that would say is it's not the reliability of the AI system, it's the problem. It's the organizational investment that's the problem. And some evidence toward this point, the economist at the Wharton School, Ethan Mollick, who writes terrific pieces on this, posted a chart the other day that showed that in the legal and recruiting professions across the economy as a whole, we see about 2% adoption of Codex, right? Like a coding tool to create AI agents that then do certain parts of your job for you. Inside OpenAI itself, those same departments, so we're not talking software engineers, we're talking the legal department, the recruiting department of OpenAI itself, is adopting at 88%, 89%. Now, I want to caution about what this means. That doesn't mean that 89% of lawyers at OpenAI are having, the majority of their job done by AI. But I think it's an interesting metric to say, who do we think the best adopters of AI in the world would be? Well, probably the people at OpenAI or at Anthropic, right? And then to look at the professions within those companies that are not software engineering, like legal, like recruitment, and say, well, they're adopting better than organizations that are not AI organizations out in the broader economy. So maybe this is a sign that what's happening is that you just need the organizational investment and the organizational know-how. And so even with AI at current reliability, we're actually going to see in the coming years a lot more white collar adoption just because organizations figure this out. What would you make of that argument?
Yeah, so again, I don't think I necessarily am in complete opposition to that argument, partially
Yeah.
because I don't think that reliability issues and organizational know-how related issues are dichotomous to one another, right? I think they're
Hmm.
related. Like I think the
Hmm.
reason that you need to engage in some level of structural reorganization within enterprises to take advantage of AI models is because you are finding out how to work around reliability related limitations, right?
Hmm.
So I don't think that, to the extent there's evidence that the real barrier is organizational know-how, that conflicts in any way with the idea that reliability is a problem and also a key explanatory variable, right? I think they're related to one another. On top of that, I don't know that I feel like the degree of adoption within frontier labs is an especially meaningful or informative signal about adoption outside of them, just because that could be indicative of a whole host of factors beyond just how reliable or capable models are for different types of occupations, right? So, in
Mhm.
other words, I think that it may just be that lawyers at OpenAI are heavily encouraged to use OpenAI models. It may be that they're automatically installed on their computers, and so some of that statistic is being artificially inflated. I'm not saying that's definitely the case. I just don't think frontier labs are very representative businesses, particularly when it comes to the question of AI adoption. And like I said, I think they would probably tell you, at least if they were being frank, that that adoption has required developing not just a lot of organizational know-how in general, but a lot of organizational know-how connected to working around reliability related issues, like which subject areas is AI more likely to generate
Mhm.
hallucinations with respect to, which subject areas are higher risk for AI deployment because if something goes wrong that creates liability issues. Like I'm sure that they have had to work around all of those same issues. So I don't necessarily think that it makes sense to oppose reliability focused explanations
Mhm.
for the rate of diffusion to organizational know-how based explanations.
Got you. I want to remind listeners that if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I will take a look and chat with Nathan about them. So again, think here about your own use in the workplace, or maybe some policies that your own organization has adopted for diffusing AI through the workplace. Nathan, I want to come back to this point. So you're saying that OpenAI might not be a good model here. Maybe it's sort of interesting but anecdotal evidence. Let's think about this from the perspective of a firm in the broader economy, right? So I'm, let's say, the CTO of a firm, let's say a lawyering firm or human resources firm doing recruitment, right? And I'm realizing that per Nathan Whitkin thought, my AIs are not that reliable. I need to figure out something to push this because there's a lot of pressure, say from investors or from the CEO, to be at the frontier of AI. And so one way I might think about this is, well, what can I do to make the AI more reliable? The other way I might think about this is, how do I set up the kinds of checks that I need to set up in order to say, hey, AI produces a bunch of answers pretty cheaply. So maybe I'll just go ahead and ask my employees to, produce a bunch of answers. I'll ask my lawyers to just have AI do 3 briefings every time, or check a few different models for the answer. And then the lawyer is just synthesizing those answers. And so the dynamic here, if I were the CTO of a company, is not, oh, gee, I just need to wait till AI gets more reliable. It's, I'm just going to use a bunch of AI, and then I'm going to make the humans do a lot more checking of the work. How does this fit in with the current state of AI reliability and what we're seeing in the actual economy?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that how useful that type of process actually is really is still dependent on reliability, in the sense that how much time you're able to save is dependent on how much error correction or how much due diligence the human in the loop has to do in
Hmm.
those situations, right? So if it turns out that the output is still filled with errors, then you're not necessarily going to be saving much time or money by generating a bunch of legal briefs that a human has to sort through. And I think this makes intuitive sense if you think about, like, in this specific example, just like the sheer amount of extra documentation that you're generating by having like
Hmm.
a bunch of example briefs that then the human is having to go through and synthesize. But even like some more sophisticated workflows that leverage like AI agents verifying each other don't necessarily
Hmm.
get around a lot of these concerns. And I think that's one question I had when I started to look into these questions. I think I naively was like, well, couldn't you just have a bunch of AI models like checking each other's work in a giant loop, and wouldn't that eventually root out all of the errors? And there's actually a bit of a research literature on that question now. And the answer, in short, is no, that doesn't really work. Like it can help a
Hmm.
little bit sometimes. But the problem is that that sort of process is in a lot of contexts just as likely to propagate errors as it is to correct for errors, because basically, like, groups of AI agents can sometimes exhibit these sort of like groupthink like properties where like one of them sees something incorrect that another one says, but it
Hmm.
assumes it's correct. And so it scores that as correct. And another agent that's acting as a verifier believes the second agent's comments on the first agent's work, right? So there's a lot of complexities to even, these sort of very AI forward kind of verification loop style solutions to
Mhm.
problems connected to reliability and verifiability. And so to zoom back out for a second, I think the question is still like, if there is going to be a verification burden at all at the
Mhm.
end of this whole process, um, how much of a bottleneck is that to sort of economic and productivity related gains, right? Like,
Mhm.
is the verification fast and easy enough that by having AI automate like the first half of the process, you're
Mhm.
greatly increasing productivity rates? Or is it the case that so much of the initial work had to do with that verification in the first place that you're
Mhm.
only increasing productivity a few percent because you're just getting rid of the easiest part of the task, right? You're getting rid of the first draft. And then you still have a human in the loop that's having to use a lot of high level judgment in any case. And so I'm not denying that there's not, productivity gains of any kind in that sort of workflow. Of course there is, and we can talk about the evidence for that. The question is just how much gain is there and how much are reliability issues going to hold back those gains.
Got you. So we've been talking at a sort of theoretical level here, which I really enjoy. I think we're coming close to time here, and what I want to do is just connect this a little bit to what we're seeing in the broader economy. And then for folks who are interested in that piece of it, a future Substack Live is going to be covering what we're actually seeing in the economy with some of the folks who are the main trackers of this at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. And so, Nathan, what we are seeing in the economy so far, based on a paper called Canaries in the Coal Mine, and a dashboard that Stanford maintains about employment broadly across the economy using payroll data, is that entry level employment, so people between ages 22 to 25, in white collar professions in the most exposed industries, and we can get into what exposed means maybe later, people in those professions are seeing a significant dip in employment. And you can see this chart right here. So this chart right here is comparing 22 to 25-year-olds. And the blue line there is the jobs most exposed to AI. And then on the right side, you're looking at the average of all groups, right? And so simple question to you here is, if reliability, if this ability to hand off tasks to AI is such a drag on workplace adoption, why would we be seeing these early signs of slower job growth or even contraction among entry-level age groups?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought this up because I think it's a really important question. And the answer is actually a pretty simple one, which is that these drops are probably not because of AI, in my opinion.
Yeah,
And I'll add the opinion of a lot of the economics profession. So I can
yeah.
talk about some of the main responses that other economists have had to this Canaries in the Coal Mine paper briefly. Um,
Hmm.
so the first thing to say is that um, the drop off that you're seeing here, and you're only actually getting a slice of it in these graphs,
Hmm.
begins before ChatGPT is initially introduced, right?
Hmm.
So immediately, that should create some alarm bells surrounding the potential that there's some confounding variable here, right? Like if this trend is beginning before ChatGPT, then obviously it's less likely to be caused by ChatGPT. But I think another kind of more incisive criticism, and this is very specific to the data in the Canaries paper, is that across the entire period they're studying, which is around November 2022 when ChatGPT is launched through September 2025, half of the entire drop off in early age employment in exposed professions happens in just that first 6 months between
Hmm.
the launch of ChatGPT in November 2022 and June 2023. And that's an argument that I'll cite. I'm getting from this particular Substack post by the Economic Innovation Group that I think is really great, called "Looking
Hmm.
for the Ladder." That's basically a rebuttal to this paper. So I'm just stealing from men here blatantly and want to flag that, but I think it's an
Yeah.
important argument. So the reason that being such a rapid shift is so important here is that I don't think it's plausible that you would see half of this entire drop off occurring in just the 6 months after ChatGPT is first released, because that's just not enough time for businesses to adopt AI in any considerable degree into their workflows. And so that's again an indication that a lot of this drop off is likely confounded and not caused by AI adoption. right? Because AI adoption is not happening nearly fast enough in those
Mhm.
first 6 months to explain the degree of drop off that we see in employment among 22 to 25-year-olds in exposed professions. And I think even putting sort of adoption and diffusion specific concerns aside, the models just were not reliable enough
Mm.
at that point, nearly so, or even capable, like focusing on capability alone. Like the initial release of ChatGPT just like is not good enough to take on much white collar labor, and I think that's pretty widely agreed on. So I don't think it's plausible that this trend is explainable by AI, just insofar as a lot of it is happening so soon after ChatGPT is first released. So I think that's one of the first main criticisms. I have more, but you look like you want to say something.
Sure. Well, I want to jump in here
Yeah.
to provide one more strong piece of evidence before we wrap here, and
Yeah.
I'll give you space to respond. But I think you're right. The criticisms of this data probably do have some compounding variables. I think right during this time, the tech companies had overhired during the pandemic, right, and so they're shedding some of that overhiring. I think interest rates are going up. Then again, we keep hearing that software engineering is the profession adopting AI because obviously AI is trained to do very well on verifiable tasks, which are software type tasks. And interestingly, what we're seeing in the profession is an increase in job growth in the profession. And not only that, but an increase in job growth that is much more significant among senior level engineers. So uh, data I have here is saying that, let's see, US job postings related to software development are up 15% since the launch of Claude Code, right? So this is to address your concern that a lot of this data is coming from 2022 when ChatGPT was first released. Now we're just talking about February of last year when Claude Code first got released. We're looking at a 15% increase in software employment. With concentration among senior level roles, 71% of that increase is due to increase in senior level software engineers. And so you can imagine this tying back. I want to sort of wrap the conversation here. You can imagine this tying back to the theory that I was proposing to you, where companies are refitting the role around checking AI's work, right? The reason you might need more higher level software engineers is because you want to prompt the AI, keep a lot of agents running at once, and then be checking the outputs. And so if I were to try to steelman the case that we're seeing the effects of AI in the workplace, that reliability is not that much of a hindrance, I think I would go ahead and cherry pick this fact. Now, I want to emphasize that it would be a cherry picked fact, and this is not how people should think about the economy overall, but it's maybe a leading indicator of the fact that reliability is not hindering job growth
Yeah.
or is not hindering adoption as much as you'd expect. Go ahead and push back on that before we
Yeah.
wrap out here.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm just gonna have to disagree again,
Right.
as
Yeah.
I know you're expecting, right? And
Yeah.
the reason is just that again, all that data is doing is just telling me about aggregate level trends after a certain point in time. But there is research out here that's using more sophisticated, causal inference to try and
Mhm.
actually tease out which of these confounders and variables are relevant, right? And so one paper that I would highlight here, which I think acts as a pretty strong rebuttal to the implication of the data point that you just brought up, is this great paper. It's titled A New Look at AI's Impact on Jobs, Firm Level AI Spending and Workforce Adjustment by a couple
Mhm.
of economists at RAMP, the payment processor, and then at Revelio Labs, which is an AI research firm. And what's really special about this paper is rather than just looking at aggregate job postings or employment across seniority, they're looking at specific firms' degree of spending per
Mhm.
employee on AI models, and then sorting them into high adopters and low adopters based on how much they're spending, and then looking at within those firms how employment is itself changing across the gradient of seniority, right? And
Right.
so what they're finding again counts, I think, pretty decisively against the implication of the argument that you just made, in the sense that one of the key results in that paper is that entry level employment share is falling for the lowest adopters within their sample and is rising for the highest adopters. right? Which is the opposite of the pattern that is implied by the data point that you shared before. And so I think why I argue that you should prefer the pattern in that paper is just because the data is more fine grained, right? They're going within firms and looking at which ones are spending the most on AI. There's just a lot of variables that could explain across an entire industry why you're seeing more hiring for seniors. But if you're going within firms and looking at the ones that spend the most and seeing that, their share of junior employees is rising, that's giving you a more fine-grained picture of the dynamics here. And so I think that speaks pretty decisively against the idea that we're seeing a sharp fall in entry-level hiring, specifically because of AI adoption.
Nathan, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Here's where I want to close this out is last week, a whole long list of economists, including 15 plus Nobel laureates, signed a statement saying that over the next 10 years, we could see, it's important, that word could is important, we could see massive transformation due to AI. And so something to keep tracking from this conversation is this gap between economists, right? Not people working at the labs necessarily, but really well pedigreed economists sounding these warning signals, and then this sparse data we're starting to see that can be interpreted in multiple ways and is sort of hard to parse. Nathan's been doing an excellent job putting some of this in context. Nathan, do you want to go ahead and plug your Substack before we get out of here?
Sure. Yeah. So I write a Substack called Arachne, where I kind of focus on a whole host of issues connected to technology and public policy. And also my academics training is actually in philosophy. So some philosophy and sort of more humanities side stuff as well. So yeah, check it out. It'd be great. And I should also just flag that 10 years out, I agree, we need to be, apprised of the possibility for greater structural transformations. All I'm saying is that we're not quite seeing that yet, but I'm definitely not a skeptic of this technology. I agree that we need to be on the lookout for employment related risks. And so, I'm all for the overall message of the letter that you mentioned, but it's not happening yet.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Nathan. And thanks everybody for
Thanks,
joining.
Kobe. All right. Bye-bye.